Alright buddy, so I couldn't find a video that showed really what I wanted to show, so I thought I would just make one really quick. So the first thing is the wires. You can twist the wires like this, which works pretty good. You can get it super tight. The problem with that is you can't then put heat shrink over the top of it, because if you do it that way, you still have a path for it to get in, and you kind of could lay it down like that and slip it over, but it doesn't work so good. The next way to do it is like this, which would allow you to use heat shrink. Obviously in this case you can't get it on anymore, but the problem with that is as you wrap at the very end, you get these little fibers that are sticking up, and then you add solder to them and they become very hard and they become sharp, and they can pierce through your heat shrink, which allows corrosion to come in. But worse than that, maybe just as bad as that, is it can touch other wires. And I actually had two wires next to each other that I had soldered in this way, and there was actually a little, like a single filament that went through the heat shrink on this wire, through the heat shrink on the next wire, and shorted my 5-volt reference on my sister's Tundra to ground, and the car actually wouldn't start. So the third technique that people recommend doing is it's like the first, but you end up stripping an extra amount of insulation so that you can lay it back down on itself. And it's kind of hard to do with one hand, sorry. You can kind of lay it back down on itself and solder it together like that. That works pretty good. It's a little bit more work, and if you buy really good heat shrink that won't, I have relatively cheap heat shrink. There's a guy at work, an electrical engineer, who said with good heat shrink you don't really have to worry about that problem with this one. This is my favorite. What you can also do is when you're done and you have those little sharp tangs, you can cut them off. But this is kind of like, let's say when you have the most amount of time and the most amount of spare cable, that's kind of the best way to do it, because you get the tight wrap that the filaments end along the length of the wire, and it works like that. Anyway, if you buy this kit, which I would recommend, I just saw last night that they make USB ones that you can run off a battery pack, but they're expensive and I think the wattage is not as high. I really like this one. It's butane. The one thing that was missing from the whole equation when I soldered as a mechanic was tip cleanliness and flux. So you can buy this big bucket of flux. It's just like a paste. This works fine. It's just kind of bulky, and you can use a brush, or what you can do is you can just dip the wires into it. I've done that many times, works great. This is what they use in electronics, and this is okay. It's a bit clumsy and long, and yeah, kind of easy to lose or snap in half. This is a pen. The pen is really used more for like electronics, really small stuff. But the one that I wish that I had, that I think I'm gonna buy, is a small bottle about that big, and it's kind of like this. It's like an eyedropper bottle with a little syringe at the end, and that would work in a variety of circumstances. Nonetheless, when you have the flux, what you really want to do is just apply a little bit. You can just do it right to the middle. You don't have to coat the whole thing in flux. Just that much would be enough. I'm gonna start the iron. And this kind of amazing thing happens, and that is when the flux melts, it chemically cleans the surface of the wire. And when the surface is clean, it conducts heat a lot easier. And then the heat from the tip can get into the wire, and then the solder can begin to flow. You can see that I coated this tip with a big blob of solder last time I stored it. You always want to store it with a big blob, and you can see that it's corroded, but what's corroded is not the tip, rather the solder that's on the tip. Yeah, this is that little silvery stuff that I was telling you about. I have a little bit that I keep in this kit, but honestly the sponge is probably enough. So once it's hot, you can actually just like snap the old solder off, and you can clean the tip. Now the downside of the sponge is that because it uses water, it cools down your tip. And they say that, over time that can be a problem. So, and then you retin the tip basically right away, and you can see basically it's already starting to corrode again. But what I want to show you here is if you use flux, the solder will basically jump to the wire, and I'm done that fast. Literally already done. And let me see if I can get it to focus. Basically, the whole thing is now covered in solder, and it only takes like a second. Now, if you didn't use a little dab of flux, what would happen is the heat transfer from the tip to the wire would be slow, and it would take longer. That's one thing. The second thing is you get so much heat buildup, you start to bubble the insulation, and the insulation gets like, you know, kind of stiff and brittle, that sort of thing, and it just takes more time. And on circuitry like electronics, you'll damage the board, and so that's why you absolutely have to have flux. And even though this is a rosin core solder, so it has flux inside of it, it still doesn't work as good. So yeah, big thing is keep your tip clean. Clean it often, re-coat it with solder often, leave it coated with solder when you store it. This is dirty. And just basically keep it a lot cleaner than you might think to. You can use like a brass brush, you know, like just a normal cleaning brush that you might have around the shop to give it a good clean. And in the worst case scenario, you can buy a little tub of this stuff called tip tinner. It's a chemical that will basically clean the tip, but I guess it's bad for the tip life. It wears it out a little bit, so you don't want to use it unless you have to. I'll send you a link to the flux that I would recommend buying, that I want to buy to replace all these. And the sponge, this comes with this. It's fine. I just had this around, so I was just leave it in there and use that instead. It doesn't cool the tip down as much. In that sense, it's better. I hope that helped, buddy. Good luck. Oh, don't forget to put the heat shrink over here because you can't add it now.